All right, looking at the bottom section on, just the paragraph above, the one on that says main interaction, talking about how Jesus spoke to the woman, and when he first spoke to the woman, she was surprised that he spoke to her, and her surprise was on two counts. One, she was a woman. Two, she was a Samaritan woman, and she made that clear in verse 9. She said, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? So she put both things out there. I'm not just a Samaritan, I'm a Samaritan woman, and you're talking to me at all, much less speaking to me in public. And then, of course, John makes the explanation, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. He's explaining why she said what she did. And then Jesus immediately turns the discussion from the physical to the spiritual. Now, I want to just take a moment. I want to take just a moment to introduce some thoughts here with respect to some things we can glean from this text. Oftentimes people that are unbelievers, infidels, atheists, agnostics, whatnot, they disregard and they disrespect the Bible, and they level various false charges against the Bible, such as the Bible is anti-woman. You've probably heard somebody or watched a YouTube video or heard somebody say, maybe on the news, well, the Bible is anti-woman. The Bible teaches, the subjugation of women, and that women are second-class citizens. And just the other day, I heard a woman interviewing Jordan Peterson, and she no sooner got those words out of her mouth than he blasted her. He said, that is absolutely not true. He said, there's not 1 ounce of truth to what you have just said. But people just assume certain things because they've heard them, not because they've studied them, and because they don't understand, for lack of a better term, gender roles that God gave us from the time that He created the home, and the gender roles that we have not only in our homes and in churches and in society, and so they just automatically they take those things and say, see, God's against women because He doesn't allow women to do this, or this, but then at the same time they don't think this. Well, God must be against men and for women because He never did send women into battle to fight a war. They don't, as the old saying is, they don't look out of both of their eyes. A lot of the issue was early on, especially in our country, if I understand correctly, before women got the right to vote, one of the things was women don't go to war. There were a lot of things that there are a lot of things that men are required to do because only men can do those things, and to discount those things, and then hold up. Well, they can't do this. They can't do this. Well, can they do this? See, so they get this messed up version of what the Bible has to say about women. Now, this text is critical, I think, to help us understand how to address that error. Look, John just makes it as a matter of fact, Jews don't have any dealings with Samaritans. And apparently, men didn't have a lot of public dealings with women. And yet, what is Jesus doing right here? He's setting an example. In other words, he's breaking down a barrier, right? Just by asking this woman for a cup of water to drink, he's broken 2 barriers, right? Was there any biblical reason for Jesus not to talk to that woman? Purely cultural, right? Was there any religious reason for Jesus not to talk to her? Let's just say it was a man. Let's say the person at the well was a man, but a Samaritan man. Was there any religious reason why Jesus shouldn't talk to him as a Samaritan man? No. And so Jesus is, here, Jesus is all about breaking down barriers. I mean, you think about, he spoke to the lawyer in Luke chapter 10 about, who is my neighbor, and he told the parable of what we call the Good Samaritan. What was he doing with that? It's breaking down barriers. Breaking down barriers. And so the barriers that Jesus is breaking down here are both religious and cultural, and dealing with matters among the genders. Now, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about this as well. When Jesus asked, by the way, we noted this just briefly last week when it said, "Woman, give me some water." And it almost like he's commanding her, but she didn't understand it that way, because you see, what did she say in response? "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me?" In other words, the translation of what Jesus said doesn't come through in our minds as a request. It comes through as a command. But the woman obviously understood what? It was a request. You ask me. You ask me. Now I want you to think about something. She's a Samaritan. She's a woman. And Jesus asks her for something. When you ask somebody for something, what are you doing to them? When you ask somebody for something, what are you doing to them? You're empowering them. Because when you ask somebody for something, and not only are you empowering them, we might even say elevating. Because if I ask you for something, that means you're
doing both. It's elevating her. It's bringing himself down as, like I would call, just an average man.
That's right. Yeah, it's empowering and elevating her, and then placing him in some way underneath, not in any way of authority or that way, but just to show, look, I need something from you, and if I need something from you, that places you in somewhat of a position over me. Is that right? And so the very idea that Jesus asked her for this cup of water was a tremendous. Well, in the eyes of the Jews, was a tremendous no-no. But what was Jesus, as Bull said, he's showing us an example of how to, of breaking down barriers. Then, and I'm going to jump to the end of the story, because at the end of the account, she goes back to the city, and she says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did." Now, those of us that are, we're familiar with the story about, go fetch your husband. And she says, "I have no husbands." And he said, "Yeah, you got that right. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you living with now is not your husband." And then, boy, she was real perceptive, wasn't she? She said, "I perceive you are a prophet." You think? You think a guy that you saw for the first time who just told you your adult life history might know a few things? But look at what he did. He used that Samaritan woman as his helper in revealing himself to the rest of the Samaritans. She helped him in the preaching of the gospel of the kingdom. Does that sound like Jesus or the Bible is anti-woman? And by the way, even given this woman's life and certainly her reputation, they went out to see Jesus. You get to the end of the chapter, and they went out to see Jesus, and Jesus taught them and talked with them, and they had this interchange, and then some of them said, now we believe, not because of what you just told, not because of what you told us, but because now we've seen it with our very own eyes. We know for certainty of who this man is. Not just because of what you said, but because you've brought us to him, and now we have seen it. So to me, that doesn't sound like Jesus is anti-woman. And by the way, we could look at a number of texts through the gospel accounts and see where a number of women were very helpful, in some ways critical to the work, the ministry of Jesus. Some of them helped him financially. Some of them that had financial means. And again, this also explodes the idea that women are second-class citizens. Because if women were second-class citizens, they wouldn't be taking their husband's money and giving it to Jesus, right? If women lived under the thumbs of their husbands, then what are these women doing, taking money and helping Jesus, as the Bible says, out of their substance? There are just so many things that if in the text that if we just stop for a minute and think about it, it helps us dispel so many of the falsehoods that people propagate about the Lord, about the church, about the Bible in general. All right, and so now moving into the bottom section on page 16. At the end of that first line, it says, he starts by asking her for a drink, then he moves the conversation to living water. Now, a friend of mine, and I've mentioned him some recently. I say he's a friend of mine. I know him through Facebook. He's the preacher at the Southwest Church in Phoenix. Interestingly enough, I've known at least two preachers that were at that same church before him that were there for a long time. But his name is John Rowe, and John baptizes 1, 2, 3 people every single week, and he goes around the country and does one-on-one evangelism seminars, teaching people how to do one-on-one evangelism. And he uses this account in John 4 in at least 1 or 2 of his sessions as a pattern for us and how we can be evangelistic. Because ultimately this was not just about Jesus being thirsty. This was about Jesus being thirsty and using an opportunity to get the gospel into some places that it might not ordinarily go. And there are lessons for us to learn that Jesus started with physical water and moved the conversation to spiritual water. The water of life. And the lesson for us is that we need to learn how to take, and I use the word mundane because it just means common everyday things. Not that there's nothing negative about the word mundane, all right? Although we might use it sometimes in that context. But just to take the mundane things of life and use those to move into the more important things, the spiritual things. And so Jesus sets an example for us in taking an everyday situation and turning it into an opportunity for evangelism. Now, I'm going to move past the last paragraph that starts at the bottom of the page and goes to the top of the next page. There's an emphasis here on on marriage. I think they make more of this account with regard to marriage than is intended by the account. Look, we know what the Bible says. The Bible says a man is to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two be one flesh, and what God's joined together, let not man put asunder. That's God's law on marriage, Matthew 19, 4 through 6. Matthew 19:9 is not God's law on marriage. It's the exception to God's law on marriage. Whoever divorces his wife, except it be for fornication, and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her that's put away commits adultery. That's the exception to the law. It's not the law. Now, look, it is a law, but it's not the law. It's an exception to the law. The law is one man, one woman for life. End of discussion. Period. End of statement. All right, but Jesus is not trying to teach this woman about marriage and divorce in this text. He's just simply letting her know, I know what kind of person you are. I know what your attitude is, obviously, about marriage, and I know what your attitude is about morality. Not only have you been married 5 times, you shacking up with a guy now. I mean, we have words for women like that, right? We probably know somebody that may not be far away from her in the way that they're living, and we have certain ideas about those types of people, right? All right. So Jesus knows what kind of person that she is, and yet what does he do? What's he do? Talk to her anyway. Not only, look, before Jesus ever said, "Woman, give me a drink," he already knew all about her, right? Because he didn't discover any of that in that early little interchange. So he already knew about her past. He already knew about her present. He already knew about her person, being a Samaritan and being a woman. And what did he do? Tried to help her get to heaven. There's the lesson for us. We want to run potential prospects through a sieve to make sure they're exactly the right prospect before we start talking to them, right? And preferably, the perfect prospect for most of us is the person that walks up and asks you to baptize them. All right, that's our prospect. That's our perfect prospect. And we've weeded out, we've sieved out, we've strained out all the other fish that might potentially be prospects. Jesus didn't practice that. Zacchaeus, Luke chapter 19, one of the most hated men. What did he do? Went and ate supper at his house. This woman was not only a woman and a Samaritan, she was a 5-time loser in the marriage game and shacked up with somebody, and Jesus didn't care. Not that he didn't care about her condition. He did care about her condition, which is why he tried to talk to her about living water. Man, the lessons in this text are incredible for us if we'll get deeper than just the overall story of what Jesus, of what's going on there. And by the way, that what I've just said is going to lead up to when we get to the end of the chapter. But now I want to just mention briefly the second paragraph. Where it says, after talking about living water and living life, that's the life that she was living at that time, the woman steers the discussion toward living worship. And so after Jesus says, go fetch your husband, and she says, I perceive you're a prophet, then she's the one that turned the conversation around, or in a different direction. Sir, I perceive you're a prophet. Now, given my perception of who you may well be, I need to ask you a question. And her question was about the distinctions between her people and Jesus' people. And the matter of worship. Now, just quickly, the Samaritans only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They were Pentateuch only, Genesis to Deuteronomy. They didn't hold to anything with regard to the books of history. Nothing in regard to the 12 books of history, the 5 books of poetry. Nothing in regard to the 17 books of the major and minor prophets. They were Genesis to Deuteronomy only. By the way, if you were a Jew in that day, you could go to heaven in those 5 books, right? You could go to heaven in those 5 books because there are no laws. There are no laws for the Jews in any of the books that come after Deuteronomy. The entirety of the Mosaic law is found in Exodus, Leviticus, and then repeated in Deuteronomy. Now, you can get to heaven on the first 5 books. So I don't want to in any way try to denigrate the Samaritan people for their so-called rejection of the historical books, the poetic books, the prophetic books, because although in rejecting the prophetic books, they're going to miss a lot about Jesus. Okay, obviously, but you're still going to learn about Jesus in the Pentateuch when you read about him in the account of Abraham, Genesis 12, and Isaac and Jacob, and then even Moses talked about Jesus in Deuteronomy 18 to 20. So you would miss a lot, but you could still know. You could still know enough from the Pentateuch. But the Samaritans were Pentateuch only. All right, and then obviously the Samaritans were a part of those 10 northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes that ended up worshiping at Dan and Bethel as opposed to Jerusalem. Whereas, the Jews all the way through their history, all the way through their exile, all the way through their return, they always kept it in their heart, Jerusalem is the place to worship God. They came back from captivity. They rebuilt the wall. They started building the temple because they understood the importance of it. They laid the foundation of the temple, and then they quit building for 16 years and started building their own houses. And that's the book of Haggai, book of Zephaniah. All right? And so, but the Jews never turned loose of Jerusalem. All right? When Daniel prayed, what was particular about his prayers? Number one, it was 3 times a day. And what was the other particular? Looking out the window facing Jerusalem. Look out the window facing Jerusalem. And so the Jews were adamant about that, and rightfully so. But the woman turns the conversation to religion and worship. She says, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. That's a true statement. She just simply stated the facts. Here's what we say. Here's what you say as Jews. I'd like for you to expound on this a little bit. You think about it. Jesus is talking to her about spiritual things. She obviously knows the division, the source of the division between the Samaritans and the Jews, and she knows that the Jews are still doing what they've always done, and we're now doing something different. It's almost like she's wanting Jesus to give her some information about, hey, is what I'm doing right, or do I need to change? Or tell me, because we're Samaritans. We've been doing this for a long time, and you've been doing that for a long time. Clarify this for me. The interesting thing is, Jesus, because let's just say, I think it's this way. Because the end of Judaism was so near. I mean, the end of Judaism was less than 3 years away. He's going to die on the cross, and he's going to be raised, and the new covenant's going to be enacted. It's going to be implemented. Now look, it's going to take a little bit of time for the gospel to get to the Samaritans, to Acts chapter 8. A little bit of time to get to the Samaritans. So Jesus is not worried at this point about getting this matter corrected about, Dan and Bethel versus Jerusalem. He's going to get her leapfrogged over that and get her to the church. And that's what he says in verse number 21. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you are neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. Now, there's a couple of different ways to take this. One would be that Jesus is saying there's a time coming when you're going to be able to worship God just about anywhere you want. But there's also, in my mind, a sense that Jesus may be saying all this fuss over Jerusalem versus Samaria is going to come to an end. And why would that be? Sean? Why would it be that all this discussion about Jerusalem and Samaria will soon come to an end? It won't be the same worship, but I'm looking for something more historical. There you go. Jerusalem fixing to get razed to the ground. Not one stone left on top of another. When the army comes in, when the army of Rome comes in and basically makes the whole city of Jerusalem look like a rock quarry or a gravel pit, there's not going to be any place to worship in Jerusalem. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Why would Jesus want to spend so much time trying to correct this woman in Samaria about Samaria or Jerusalem when that whole thing's just fixed to get wiped out? It's fixed to get wiped clean. And when that happens, the church is already in place, and we know that the church can worship God anywhere.
I go with this statement here with your first statement about Jerusalem being destroyed.
Right.
Because it says neither place.
That's right. Neither place.
That mountain's probably still there.
That's right.
So I lean to
Yeah, I do too. But I think there is the secondary part about, and look, I don't think Jesus is trying to talk to her about the destruction of Jerusalem. But it may well be that woman lived long enough to see it and understand it after the fact. Kind of like when the disciples didn't understand what Jesus said when he said, "Destroy this temple," and in 3 days I'll build it back up. And they didn't understand what he said until he was raised from the dead. John chapter 2 teaches us that. It may be that woman, obviously, she's going to remember what Jesus said to her. And if she lived long enough to see Jerusalem destroyed, she goes, "Oh man, that guy I talked to at the well, he said more than I thought he did." He said more than I thought he did. I see what he's talking about. So Jesus is trying to point her past the divisions, past the temporal, get her to the spiritual, get her to the eternal. The church is going to worship me anywhere it meets. Anywhere it meets, the churches, and by extension, a Christian can worship. Can worship God. In other words, there's no set location for a Christian to worship God, and so he's talking about that now. I'm going to do this next section and I'll quit. This is the section above a small distraction where the woman perceives he's a prophet, and it goes into Jesus has to be one of three things. One of three things. Many people. The introductory statement is, many people think Jesus was just a prophet or even just a good man, a wise teacher, a first century Confucius or, whatever. But Jesus can only be one of three things. All right. Number one, he was a lunatic. He was crazy. Some of the truth statements that Jesus made about himself. I mean, think about it. Well, I'll just give you an example. When I lived in the parsonage, we had some pretty interesting characters come through. All right? And one guy came through on his way to Memphis. And I didn't know how long he'd been gone. Turned out he'd been gone from home for 7 years. It was obviously the guy had mental problems and had probably, given his behavior, I figured he's probably a heroin addict. Because he got a cup of coffee and he filled it about half full of coffee and about half full of sugar. And as I was taking him, I was going to give him a ride out to the interstate because he's going to hitchhike and get home. And I said, man, I'll carry you to the interstate. You might be home before dark. So we're on our way out to the interstate, and he starts talking to me. He says, you've probably read about me in the Bible. I said, I have. Really? He said, yeah. He said, you know that guy 666? He goes, that's my dad. I said, is it now? And he said a few other things. But that guy was a lunatic, right? He made some true statements about himself that were evident that that guy was nuts. Right? Well, to a lot of the people in the world of the first century, Jesus made some statements about himself that are crazy. Anybody who claims to be God is immediately assumed to be nuts, right? And yet Jesus made those claims. So some people think that Jesus is a lunatic. Some people just say he's a liar. He's just a deceiver. You remember in Acts chapters 4 and 5 when they took the apostles in and Gamaliel said, now wait a minute. Y'all remember a while back a man named Judas arose and he had about 400 men that followed after him and they all died in the wilderness. They said, now if this guy ain't nothing but if he's nothing but a liar, a deceiver, his followers will all come to know. In other words, he could just be a deceiver. He could just be a liar. And by the way, there's a lot of those in the world that draw people after them. And then the third one is, well, if he's not a liar or a lunatic, he's got to be the Lord. If he's not a liar and he's not a lunatic, then he's the Lord. And that makes sense. That makes sense to us that Jesus can only be one of three things. But I heard a fourth option last week that I found interesting. And somebody in a question and answer session asked Ben Shapiro, who's an Orthodox Jew, what his thoughts were on Jesus. And he made the same argument. He said Jesus was either a lunatic, a liar, or he's the Lord. So what's your view? As a Jew, what's your view on Jesus? Is he a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord? And I thought, man, I'm interested to hear how this goes. What? No, here's what he said. And by the way, this shows you that Ben Shapiro is a terrible biblical scholar and a terrible textual critic. He said there's a fourth option. There's a fourth option. He said the fourth option is that Jesus was a good man, but I don't trust the integrity of what the New Testament says about him. And a lot of the things that the New Testament says that he said about himself, I don't believe he ever said that. In other words, he criticized the integrity of the New Testament text. Which, look, for Shapiro is because he goes, look, he said it right out loud. He goes, look, as a Jew, I don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. And any good Jew would say that. I don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But he came up with that fourth option because the vast majority of his audience are Christians. And by the way, he expresses a great appreciation for Christianity and for all the so-called Christian traditions and what Christianity, in a general sense, has done in the formation of this and the propagation of this country and democracy and all that. So he had to come up with a fourth position. And the fourth position is he was a really good man, but a lot of what they said that he said about himself is not true. And what I'd like to say is, dude, there's 24,000 pieces of catalog manuscript evidence in the New Testament. Say, the evidence is a whole lot better than you just deciding to casually dismiss it, dismiss it as being unreliable. But that was his take, the fourth take. All right, Lord willing, next week we'll start and finish this lesson and this chapter. We'll start with the small distraction.
If he took the third option, there's only one thing for him to do.
That's right. If he took the third option, he's going to quit being a Jew.
He had to convert.
That's right. Have to convert.